Hey everyone, you are now tuning in to the Life at Humber podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'm your host, Amanda Soriano, and on today's episode, we're going to be sharing a conversation led by the BASE. And if you're not familiar with the BASE, that's totally cool. BASE stands for Black Academic Success and Engagement, and the BASE is an equity hub on campus that seeks to provide students who identify as Black, African, and Caribbean with community, resources, and supports to help folks maximize their experience on campus. It's also important to note that this type of programming is available to all Humber College and University of Guelph-Humber students. The conversation we're going to be sharing today is the third event in a three-part series dedicated to unmasking, navigating, and responding to racial injustice. Titled Responding with Allies, this panel discussion talks about what it means to be an ally, key components of allyship, and different ways Black and non-Black students and community members can work together in addressing differences. We are so excited to share this conversation with you, but before we get started, I want to share who is part of this conversation. So first up, we have our moderator, who is Monique Chambers, and she is the Student Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives Coordinator. And our panelists include Siobhan, Steph, and Tola. Siobhan has been a counselor at Humber for the past 13 years. She currently works at the Lakeshore campus, and as a counselor, she works from an anti-oppressive, social justice, feminist, and culturally informed lens. She is pursuing doctoral studies in counseling psychology at the University of Toronto, and her areas of research are Caribbean healing practices and race and cultural and interracial relationships. Up next, we have Steph, who uses they/them pronouns, who is a non-binary and transgender part-time support staff at Humber College. They work in the LGBTQ+ Resource Center as the program assistant. Steph is also an alumni of Humber College's Child and Youth Care degree program, and most of their work centers the experience of transgender students and youth. Last but definitely not least, we have Tola, who is a human rights advisor at the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Diversity at Humber, and she is also a licensed lawyer. During her time as a junior litigation lawyer, Tola has provided legal advice on an array of issues focusing on the areas of refugee and humanitarian and civil litigation law. Tola has also appeared on behalf of her clients before the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Tola's portfolio at Humber includes early intervention, consultation into human rights-related concerns, conducting human rights investigation, and mediation. She is also a member of the EDI Committee and EDI Task Force, where she is a lead of the campus culture working groups. Sounds like we have a really awesome group of folks here discussing this topic, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us by searching Life at Humber on Instagram and sending us a DM. If you want more information on future events run by the BASE, you can also find them on Instagram by searching the BASE Humber. And with that said, enjoy and stay safe, folks.
So hello again, everyone. Welcome to today's session. On behalf of my amazing team, I want to take this time to formally welcome you all today. My name is Monique Chambers, and I'm the coordinator for Student Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives with the BASE program. And before we dive in, I'd like to do our land acknowledgement. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge the land in which I stand on. As a Canadian-born citizen in this country, I recognize that I am privileged to call this place home, and I would like to pay tribute to the original inhabitants of the land. Humber College is located within the traditional and treaty land of the Mississauga of the Credit, known as Etobicoke, the land of the place of the Black Elders in the Michisaukee language. The region is uniquely situated along Humber River watershed, which has historically provided an integral connection for Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples between the Ontario Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay regions. Now home to people of numerous nations, Etobicoke continues to provide a vital source of interconnection for all. I finish by stating that there have always been Indigenous peoples in the spaces that we all call home, and there always will be. And I recognize that they are the first inhabitants of this land. I am therefore privileged to engage in a dialogue today around power and privilege and allyship when I myself am a settler on this land. Okay, thank you. So last week we had a great dialogue on personal and collective healing and how it's important for us to not just survive, but to thrive in a society that has been structurally built on inequality and to maintain inequitable practices. The question is, how do we change this? How do we change a system that has been set up to literally pin each and every one of us against each other, to pin different groups of people against each other? How do we change this? How do we change the system? And so we at the base believe that it begins by recognizing who we are in relation to others and how we can use what we have literally in our hands. And so I'm talking about privilege to help benefit those who are treated unjustly. And so this being said, the working definition that I'd like us to keep in mind is that an ally is a person who uses their privilege to advocate on behalf of someone else who doesn't hold that same privilege. Allies are defined by their actions. I know one of the biggest concerns, people who have been defined as part of a minority group, and I use quotations there, as part of a minority group, one of the major concerns with predominantly white institutions is their lack of inclusion. It was Kalani Tonga that said, "Be mindful of which voices are missing from the table. Seek out and amplify those voices." We can't talk about inclusion without talking about the importance of developing a sense of belonging for all. Steph, you may not understand the Black experience, so to speak, in its various forms, but perhaps you can speak to what it was like on campus when you were a student and how it informs the work that you do today as an LGBTQ resource center assistant. How important is developing a sense of belonging for those who are often othered?
So to talk in regards to my time as a student. So as much as, of course, I don't experience anti-Black racism, but you can see it around you. And the reasons why I kind of developed that ability to be in tune, or not perfectly in tune, but at least recognize certain things, is because I'm a transgender individual. And as a trans person navigating on campus, I noticed that there were experiences that I was having, and it was really overwhelming, right? So when my professors would misgender me often or use the wrong name for me, waiting 20 minutes for a washroom that matches my gender, certain things that like just add up. It's like Band-Aids, like on little tiny bruises, right? And so I noticed when I was talking about my experiences being trans, the people that were most likely to hear me and recognize that maybe they don't experience the same things, but they're willing to listen to me, were people that were also othered, right? And so when I hear the word othered, I think about navigating a system that's not built for you, right? System that's built for someone else. And so in my conversations with peers that were also othered, I was able to build those skills of, okay, if I know that I don't belong and other people don't belong, there's problems here. And it taught me that critical thinking of like, okay, well, even in my own communities, there's anti-Black racism living there. There's ableism living there. How in the LGBTQ plus community are we perpetuating those things and also not sitting down when we should be sitting down and not standing up when we should be standing up? And so in my role today, because I had those experiences, it's kind of like, the push of once you're given a spot where you can do advocacy for students, show up and listen to what their needs are so that those that are experiencing that othering, they don't have to sit with that by themselves. Because I know that if I had to sit with that by myself, it would be impossible to go through 4 years of college, right?
I think that's sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it's just like that reality of like, even like the education system is built for white, cisgender, able bodies. And that's something that needs to be dismantled, and can't do that without talking about it.
You're right. Absolutely. I think that's a huge question. How are we perpetuating these same things, these same privileges? I'm just curious, audience members, I'm going to encourage you to participate at this time. And as well, panelists, maybe you can share what are the different ways people are othered? What are the different, maybe you can share your experiences. What are the different ways you've experienced this othering? Because sometimes we participate, whether or not it's intentionally or unintentionally, in othering folks. So I want to kind of just open that up to audience members and panelists, if you want to share as well from your own personal experience. What are the different ways we may intentionally or unintentionally other folks.
I could go. This is Christina Alcina, Manager of Equity and Student Life. I think language is really powerful, and that's a really important way that we can other folks. And language is always evolving, but I think it's important for all of us, whether that be students, faculty, or staff, to stay up to date with the current language that is evolving, just to make sure we're not othering folks. I know something as simple as I came from a one-parent household, so saying parents really bothered me growing up, and as small as that is, I can only imagine ways in which other identity-based language can be othering and really harming for someone's experiences.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Just to echo Christina's point, I think with language, certain comments that are made, certain questions that are asked, right, kind of going to someone's private space. And, you know, the Ontario Human Rights Code or Tribunal, they're really adamant on the intent versus impact, the questions that you're asking. You may have a good intent to want to know to get someone, but the impact that you're creating, that you're causing, is what really has that sort of hurtful impact onto someone. So yeah, language and comments and questions that are being asked, not being mindful around that.
I would also
Go
say,
ahead.
yeah,
Mhm.
I would say that, like, in the context of like how we other people, it's like when we make assumptions, right? We assume that like when someone's hurt by something that we say, that we have to be defensive, or that we have to like say sorry in certain types of ways, or we make an assumption about their personhood, like asking certain questions, and they're super disrespectful, and you might, like Tola was saying, have the best intentions, but your curiosity can really harm someone. It's not okay to ask questions without being critical, like, oh, could this really hurt someone else? Like, could this be something that they've been asked by a billion other people, and it's like little mosquito bites? Like, what's the impact there?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually want to rebuttal that, but Ian, I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak, and then I will, Steph.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want. I think. So what I was going to add, and I think it's what Christina is saying, and a bit of what Steph's saying. And I'm seeing what Chantel's written too about omission, and one of the things that that I think I, as a white man who went to university or went to post-secondary, right, and that has been a part of the consideration is when I use my own experience to perpetuate the systems that are currently built to keep people out, right? So when I am speaking with a student and I go back to, my brain goes back to, well, this is how it happened for me. Mm-hmm. Challenging the bias of saying, well, why don't you do this, or why don't you do that, or like, so it really is the othering can happen from a space of using my own experience and actually like overlaying that in terms of, next steps or even programmatic design, right? And thinking about, creating or perpetuating those systems through an experience that worked for me because it's built for me. So, yeah.
And I think, Monique, to add to Ian's, I think sometimes this is I think about, for example, a student who says, I have to drop off my 3 kids because I'm a single mom. My prof said I have to be in my class at 8 o'clock and I have to leave at 5, but I have a night class, and there's no exceptions around that. So I think, and when we look at unequal distribution of like wealth, and we look at who are being, who need the accommodations, who are the support, and when the structure is not being flexible, when it's not supporting that, I think that's a way that we're othering students from an institutional framework.
Absolutely. I guess one of the questions, Steph, as you were sharing, was that I came to mind was, how do we safeguard our curiosity? Because I think that's a real danger that we have to be mindful of. And I think another question, just to follow up with you, Siobhan, would be around like, what are the kind of tangible ways we can safeguard ourselves or become aware? How do we increase our awareness in perpetuating those same systems that oppress different groups of people, right? And so, Steph, I know that you're working in the LGBTQ plus resource center, and so how does your center work to combating that?
Totally. So like that sense of belonging, and like how do we try to make our space aware of the different things that you have to be aware of? Cool. So I guess at the resource center, it's kind of like we have formal ways where we address things and then informal ways in which we try to practice, right? So formally, the space we operate in, we have like these guidelines for having a good time. And in those guidelines, it shares things like recognize how much space you're taking up, recognize the conversations that you're having, that they could be harmful. Take breaks when you need to take breaks. Make sure that you're aware of the words that you're using, because we are an anti-oppression kind of framework. Recognize that the weight of your words are strong and that they could have a big impact on people, right? Also, the space, like all spaces on campus, I would assume, are informed by the OHRC. So another thing to be aware of is that the Ontario Human Rights Code is what is informing our conversations as well. If you're doing things that damage individuals, that are perpetuating racism, transphobia, that are perpetuating ableism, how do we call you in? And that's the kind of method that we use in the center. So like if we hear something racist, we call it in, like, oh, why would you say that? Can you come talk to me or Matthew, the head of the LGBTQ plus resource center, and we'll have a conversation about like, why would you say something like that? What are different ways that you can avoid saying things like that cause that harm? And if worse comes to worse, if they're still perpetuating those racist stereotypes or making comments that are just not cool and are harmful, we're going to have to ask that you leave the space, and you might need to take a break from being in our space because you're harming other people. I think a couple of the other things that we do is people that are working in the space, we try not to make assumptions about people because stereotypes run deep and they've been taught to us in so many different ways. And so how do you call yourself in if you're making an assumption about a person by the way that they look or the way that they talk or the way that they hold themselves? And then I think the last thing that we like, that I know for myself as well, that I try to keep in mind is that this should be trust-based. So I'm not going to make an assumption that someone wants to talk to me about their problems. If they're going through something, I have to build that trust in order for them to trust me, right? I'm not going to make an assumption that, oh, well, something terrible has happened, they're going to trust me enough to talk about it. But if I can work on building that rapport with them, if I can build that trust, then we can be a team. We can work together in order to make the space as safe as possible for you. And so I think that's what informs a lot of the conversations that I have with the students that enter our space. How do I build that trust with them and show that I'm on their team? Yeah.
That's good. I really appreciate the fact that a lot of the language that that you all have curated is very action oriented. And I love the fact that it's also very reflection based. And I think that is key when we're engaging in any kind of equity work. That being said, Tola, just wondering, as the advisor for human rights, equity, and diversity, would you say that there is a danger in not being intentional around developing a sense of belonging?
I would definitely say yes, there is a danger. And so when I think of a sense of belonging, or the opposite of sense of belonging, I think of isolation, right? I think of othering, as we're talking about, and the impact that it creates is an invisibility for that individual, right? The more that the individual feels isolated, the more that the individual feels like there's no sense of belonging, it really can eradicate a person's sense of identity. I think it's safe to say here that identity is really important, right? And when you are someone who feels there's no intentionality around sense of belonging, an individual feels isolated, it really goes down deep to their self-worth, to their self, to their identity of who they are as their being. And so I think that, it really interferes with the person's ability to connect with others, right? So there is a danger when there's no intentionality around ensuring that folks are feeling a sense of belonging at Humber. And just going on with othering, it also leads to a sense of tokenism, right? So there's just so many factors to that. But what I really want folks to really understand is that it can really lead to eradication of someone's self of being, of someone's self of worth, and someone's sense of identity.
You don't realize how deep it runs until you hear someone like you break it down. Oh my goodness.
Yes, I mean, I learned from a lot of people, but, just from my own experience, just being a racialized woman, you really understand what it feels like to walk somewhere and you're not seen, right? And, as strong as you may want to be, as tough as people have taught you to become, and to have the self-worth, the little poke that people can have, and you can really slowly eradicate your self-worth, right? And so it really pushes you to become into like a shell, right? Because you want to protect yourself, but not knowing that it's actually creating and causing damage to your being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are there ways that we can kind of engage in, or to keep in mind, to avoid tokenism? Are there things to keep in mind?
Definitely. And I think for folks who may not know what tokenism is, it's, tokenism is the idea that, it's diversity without the inclusion, the official idea of diversity without inclusion. And so I think the first thing that folks should really be focusing is on the culture. So whether you're at school, whether you're in an institution, organization, look at the culture around you. Are you seeing that there's a lack of diversity around you? And if you're seeing that, what can you do to diversify? Should there be like an internal audit to ensure there's diversity? But I would also look at intentionality. If you are wanting to diversify, really look at your intent as to why you want to do so. Do you really see a value in diversifying so that it kind of eradicates the idea of tokenism? Do you see how it benefits your organization, your school, your department? Or are you only doing it to check off a diversity box, that you've done your job, you're good, and that's it, right? And so looking at intentionality, which I feel like is so important, because there are organizations, institutions, classes where folks are trying to diversify, but maybe their system is not allowing them to. Maybe they're very short in resources to do so. So there's an intentionality to diversify, but really collaborating and ensuring that there's diversity and inclusion together, mixing it together. Also, I would say that acknowledging one's identity, right? So say, for example, you're an institution that, your intent is to diversify and bring a sense of inclusion. Are you ensuring that person can bring their identities to work, to their department? Are you ensuring that they're not just leaving some part of their identities at home, but they can bring it to work? Ensuring that when you're acknowledging at one's identity, you're actually benefiting and leveraging their experiences at your institution, at your department, at your place of work, right? And just realizing what they can bring with bringing their identities and acknowledging that. And I think another way to kind of avoid tokenism is accommodating, looking at the resources that you do have to accommodate those folks who may be racialized, or to folks who are equity seeking folks. Seeing what resources that there are, engaging, ensuring that there's more engagement, changing the way that you have meetings, the littlest things, right? Ensuring that those folks are more engaged in their conversations, or even just mentorship. I know that Humber, like what we're looking into is having ERGs, employee resource groups, for Black African groups and other groups, and ensuring that you have those type of resources for those folks who may feel isolated, so they have a place, a space where they can go to really ensure their identity is kind of being catered to and acknowledged.
Great, thank you. Those are some really great questions that you shared with us. Thank you. And I'm just kind of peeking at the chat, and I can see some people are doing some self-reflection or some reflection of the spaces that they're in. I like a particular comment, really resonates with me: the ability to bring your full self to work. Mm-hmm. That's huge. Or your full self to school, right, is so important. So thank you so much. Siobhan, I can't, as we talk about developing a sense of belonging, I can't help but think about the fact that you're the only counselor at Humber's Lakeshore campus who is a person of color. What is that like for you? And how does your lived experience inform the work that you do?
That's a very good question. And I must say, as Tola was saying, the intention of me being asked to go to the Lakeshore campus was because there was no representation. I do think that it was intentional, and I do think it was for, this was years ago. I do think that there was a recognition that there was a gap. So my identity. So as an Indo-Caribbean immigrant, settler, woman of color, I definitely think that I can, use my lived experiences to support and to find a nugget, even though that if I'm working with Black students, even though that our experiences might be dramatically very different, can I find a nugget of overlapping culture, understanding, share pain, story of immigration that I can use. So it has been, important. So for example, I'll give you an example where, there's a professor, I don't know if Dr. Ray Reese, who's just recently left for Ryerson University. But for example, she referred quite a few of her students to counseling, and the students would ask, well, is this a Black counselor? And she said no. And then she said, well, can I share a little bit about the counselor's background? She's from the Caribbean. And she said sometimes she got yes, and sometimes she got no. So the nugget of similarity that I could use based on my experience to support students is very important. Now, with that said, I also have to recognize my experience is very, very different. I have to recognize my privilege. I have to recognize and own that there is a racial hierarchy, that the system of stratification puts me in an area of privilege compared to a Black student or Black bodies. So I also have to recognize intersectionalities in students as well, LGBT plus Black folks with physical or mental abilities. And so to go back to your question, I can use my lived experiences. However, I also have to socially locate myself, identify my privileges, and identify when I am not the person to support someone because I don't have that unique Black experience that is very different from my own. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I'm thinking about the student that you were kind of talking about, and any student for that matter that's never accessed your services, that would like to, that needs to, but they're reluctant because they don't see representation of themselves. They don't see their own identity. What would you say to that student?
I would say to that student, you're absolutely right. And I would empathize and I will validate. So I would say, absolutely, you're absolutely right. This is where we drop the ball. This is where there's a gap and we need to address this gap. With that said, what I would do and because this is a situation, I think all the counselors, we work with many, many Black and racialized students, and we can meet them where we are at. So that requires us to educate ourselves. That requires us to step back and to let students educate us. But also, it's not also recognizing that, to say that it's not fair that you don't have someone that represents you. So I think our role then is to address where we can meet those students and also facilitate a referral, a transfer to get a support worker, a Black therapist, a counselor, who can meet that student based on what their needs are. So I think our role is to listen, validate, say, yeah, like you're right, but also not leave it there, because this is how, when we asked about how are we allies, this is how we challenge the system, the structure. We also address the gap individually. So I think for many ways we can, and then some students will stay, and lots of students will stay, and some say, this is not a good fit for me. So, yeah.
I think it's great. I'm just looking at one of the points in the chat, and someone shares that it's important to listen to the unique stories and not overgeneralize everyone's experiences. And so I want to ask you, are there some dangers, Siobhan, that you can think of that you'd like to highlight for those in the helping profession to consider?
Absolutely. So when I shared my experience as a racialized woman, Indo-Caribbean, and I can relate. So if I can make an assumption, oh, I get you because I'm also from the Caribbean. Oh, I get that because, I lived in Jamaica, I lived in Guyana. So I get it. So if I have this approach, then I'm treading really, really unethical waters, basically. So the dangers are color blindness, not recognizing that there is a racial hierarchy, not recognizing that maybe, as much as you might be an ally, so it can be a racialized ally, someone like myself, not recognizing that if I'm sitting with a person, if I'm sitting with a Black student, my people have probably been part of anti-Black racism, right? So recognizing interrogating my own biases, my own prejudices. So I think that's what helpers need to do, and not just counselors. I'm talking anyone who's working with students, faculty, career advisors, ALS consultants. I think we need to interrogate our biases, and we also need to look at this as not a short-term allyship. We need to look at longitudinally, is this a commitment that I'm willing to make, and I'm willing to make for a very long time? Why am I willing to make this commitment? And also sometimes asking yourself, am I the right person to support this person, right? We might go and be like, oh yeah, this is my role, I am the right person. And sometimes acknowledging and say, I am not the right person, and that's okay. But I'm not going to leave it there. I'm going to facilitate contact with someone who is skilled, someone who is Black, someone who is able to provide you the support that you deserve. But all, like, similar to all students, maybe white students can just access that support because they're a majority of white helpers. We need to sort of like level that as well, and we need to do our role as allies.
No, absolutely. No, it was great. And I really appreciate the fact that you brought that up. It's important for us to recognize that we may not be there yet. We may not be where we would like to be. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and still facilitate the contact, right? Because that in itself is stepping in the right direction, right? And so I think I'm glad you brought that up. Something else you touched on was the idea of empathy, and empathy is such an important tenet to allyship. What does this action word, empathy, mean to you, and what does it look like in your spaces? And this is open to panelists. This is open to the audience as well. What does empathy, this action word, what does it mean to you, and what does it look like in your spaces? Take a moment to think about it.
I can respond, but I also want to make sure that that everyone has a chance.
You're good to go. Go ahead, Siobhan. You can start us off.
Just quickly with empathy. I think it's a start. I think it's a starting point. And I think it's important because what I'm saying when I'm sitting with someone, I'm saying I see your pain, I see the injustice, I see the fear, I see the trauma, and when I say that, I can cross racial lines. I don't have the experience, I don't have the lived experience, but I see it and I hear it, and I'm going to listen to you. And I think something that I read the other day about radical empathy is about if we want to really understand the experience of Black folks and racialized folks, we have to be willing to change ourselves to get to radical empathy. And that might be tricky.
Wow, that's great.
Can I just add just with what Siobhan's saying? When I think of empathy, I think of checking my own ego. I think of checking my own pride, and I think of checking my own biases, and I remind myself that it's not about me, right? And I remind myself that I'm going down to that person's level right now because it's funny. I'll always tell my friends, like, I feel like if you're on the ground and you're flat and you're tired, I will go on the ground with you and fight and stare at you until you want to talk. That's how I see empathy, is going down to level that person and checking my own pride and my own ego, that it's not about me, right? It's not my turn to discuss about my own issues or my own emotional responses. It's about that person. So that's how I see empathy.
Absolutely. Acknowledgement. Go ahead. Oh, Steph, yeah, you're on mute.
I didn't even notice I muted myself. That's so funny. So I would also, I guess, add that like a lot of the time that reminds me of white guilt too, and like killing white guilt. So white guilt, is it helping anyone? Like, is it helping motivate conversations or actually like creating change? When we are experiencing feelings of like white guilt, you're actually just centering your whiteness as if it is the most important thing in the conversation. Oh, well, I'm trying to be a good white person, or I'm trying to be better. What are your intentions then? Like, if your intentions are to be better for yourself and to be that good person, then you're actually not mobilizing change. You're not trying to make the world less racist or make people less racist, or you're not trying to center the fact that for over 400 years, Black people have been impacted by racism at the hands of white people. And so like, I have to check myself. That's empathy. Empathy is me checking myself and being like, why am I doing this? Like, are my intentions truly to make change, or are they selfish? Check your selfishness. And I think that goes with like that ego death. Like, how do I kill my ego in this situation and make it so it's not about me? It's not about whiteness. It's about, let's fix this. This is wrong. Let's fix this.
Just want to read a couple of, thank you, Steph. Just want to read a couple of points in the chat. Someone says, I try to teach my students the difference between empathy and how it is different from sympathy. Pity can too often be oppressive. Empathy is about trying to understand the perspective of one another or of another. One of the things that I teach in a workshop around allyship is the importance of trying to remember, bring yourself back to a time when you were made to feel vulnerable. Because if you can try to bring yourself back to that place, it's going to be much easier for you to truly see, as you were saying, Siobhan, see the pain, right? So these are some really great points. Just as a follow-up question, you know, it has been said that guilt is not a useful emotion for an ally, which is what you're hitting on, Steph. Tola, why do you think this is? Why do you think guilt is not a useful emotion?
So for me, this is how I see guilt. Guilt is ineffective if there's no action that follows, right? And so I was reading an interesting article the other day, and the author was sort of giving an analogy about guilt. And it's sort of like if you are walking down the street and you see a random stranger on the floor and they're hurt and they're brutally murdered, or they're hurt, they're in pain, and you're trying to be a good Samaritan, you're trying to help them, but then you realize that you forgot your cell phone, so you can't call 911. So how long do you pace yourself, berating yourself with the fact that you've forgotten your cell phone, or berate yourself with the fact that I don't know CPR, or I don't know how to help this person? Or do you take the actions to help that person? And I know to some folks, they may think, well, Tola, what are you talking about? Like, this is a life and death situation. What are you talking about? But I challenge folks to understand that racism is life and death, right? There's violence that is attached to the racism. There's violence that's attached to oppression, right? So it is life and death. And so what guilt does is it devalues the ability for an ally to really recognize, to be helpful, to be of an assistance, right? So when you're thinking about guilt, it paralyzes that person to be able to have these difficult conversations about race, power, and privilege. And so what it really does is that it really impacts that person to withdraw and defocus themselves, kind of like what Seth was talking about, and really focus on their emotional response and not actually focus at the issue that is at hand, the essence of the issue, right? So it just really rehabilitates someone. It doesn't really do much for someone. Actually marginalize folks, right? It just adds more of that impact to racialized folks, to oppressed folks. It doesn't really do much for that.
That's great. Does anyone want to add to that as well? Like, why is guilt not a useful emotion? Maybe the impact of guilt, or perhaps you can even share what's working for you. How are you able to move past guilt? Because we often are confronted with that emotion either the beginning of our journey towards allyship or even right throughout, right? What are you doing to combat? Does anybody want to respond to that? And that's open to audience members as well. Thank you for sharing the chat. There's so many great comments in there. Go ahead, sorry, Tola.
No, I was going to say, just, I know that when it comes to allyship, that, you know, it's a journey for different folks, right? It's an individual journey. And so I recognize the fact that for some folks, you know, they've been doing this for a while. For some folks, they literally just heard of the word allyship, right? So I recognize that it's a work in progress. You know, Rome was not built in one day, but I encourage folks to really sit in their discomfort, right? I encourage that, because guilt is still an emotion that we all have to a certain extent, and we can't ignore that guilt. But sit in that discomfort, not wallow in it. Don't dwell in it, but sit in it. And while you're sitting in that discomfort, think about the words, the questions that are coming up. Because the questions that you're coming up, I'm sure they're valid. Like, why are we here? Why this? Which will lead to action-oriented push, right? Do the work and read and really gain that racial resilience, to be able to have those tough conversations, right? To really read and to ask yourself those questions and find the answer to those questions that you're thinking about, so that it can lead to action. So sit in that discomfort and do the work and read and educate, you know, but really sit in that discomfort and understand that guilt does not erase the reality of things, right? It doesn't really do much.
Yeah.
But sit in it and start to think about those questions that are coming to your mind, and use those questions to learn and to read. And then that's how the actions come out of that.
Tola, I
Thank
think
you.
that's so excellent. I just want to add, if that's okay, I think that is so great, because I think oftentimes guilt, from a counseling perspective, it can be so debilitating. And if we are sitting in guilt and that comes with tears, that can be oppressive. So I read a really good article a while ago about how tears from the oppressor can be oppressive, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not action oriented, as you said. So, but guilt, I think, also can be a good social regulator. It can tell me I am doing something to impact someone else. So if we can use guilt, as Tola say, to do the right thing, to do some repairing, to do some self-interrogation, then I think we're using guilt, which is a human emotion. It's there. It's not going to go away. We've got to do something about it. But if we can use it to say, okay, I need to interrogate myself and do some repairing, both internally and externally, then I think guilt can actually be a useful indicator, because without it, we don't know where we're messing up or we've done something really horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I see here, guilt can only manifest in one or two ways. You will either be paralyzed or defensive. Neither is productive or healthy for anyone. I see also, guilt does not erase reality. I love this. Yeah. I think that true humility is also needed, as has been mentioned by each of the panelists. It's not about you, your feelings, your solutions, your guilt. Humility allows you to step back. And I think, as you were sharing with us, Siobhan, that guilt is a good self indicator. There we go. I wanted to say regulator, but no. It's a good indicator. And that we should really sit in that discomfort and to self-interrogate. Why am I feeling this way? And what can I do to move past it? So those are great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Also, we also have to ask ourselves as allies, as racialized allies, or white allies, that is it my space to take up this conversation to talk about my own guilt? It's probably not. Do the work, recognize it, interrogate your guilt, but it's not maybe the space to talk about your guilt. You can get support, figure it out. That's part of the system that worked for you. Maybe it's not the space, right? And that's why it can be tears resulting from guilt can also be quite oppressive and silencing to the people who actually need the space, that haven't had the space. So, yeah.
Thank you. April Dawn, I saw that your hand was up and then you put it back down. Did you want to share something?
Trying.
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. My computer's delayed. My apologies. Siobhan actually was speaking to what I was going to try and say, is that recognizing that you shouldn't be taking that space, leaving that space for others, because you've had the space for so long. So, and trying to recognize too the way that you can actively show you're listening. actively show you're engaged, actively show you're trying to understand, without it being inauthentic to that person. Because I think what just struck me, what you've said, is that your emotional response to the trauma someone has felt or experienced, such as tears, can be oppressing, which is back to what we started with. Like, that's the least of your intentions, but you're trying to be authentic in the moment and understand that pain or trauma issue or circumstance someone's gone through, but staying away from having to do that. And this is now where I'll be quiet because I've already had my voice in other forums, but I'm really appreciating this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's great. So as we move forward in our conversation around action and allyship, I'm curious, Steph, from your experiences, what lessons have you learned about allyship? What actions do more harm than good?
So I've learned lots of lessons about allyship through getting things right and then getting things wrong, right? And so I guess for myself, the biggest thing that I'm learning and have been learning is that allyship, like we said at the beginning, is a verb. You can't just say sorry to your Black peers. That's where that white guilt manifests. How is that guilt manifesting, and being aware of how it's manifesting? So taking the time to be reflective on how we're doing allyship too. Being prepared to be wrong, but also recognizing in making mistakes, you're still perpetuating harm. So when I make a mistake, if I can't sit with that mistake and recognize the reasons why I've made it, and also recognize that not everyone has to accept an apology from me. If I can't move past that mess up, then how am I actually going to keep mobilizing change, right? And so I guess the biggest thing is that, yeah, mistakes happen, but it's not an excuse for diminishing the harm that you cause. And that if I looked at all my mistakes, if I just kind of gave up, then now I'm not actually doing anything in allyship. Also, I think another really key point is that I don't call myself an ally. I think that that's up to other people to discern whether or not my actions are actually allyship actions. I don't get to decide what is the action of an ally. I have to listen to what's needed. How can I utilize my privilege in order to mobilize change? How can I utilize sitting down and being quiet and letting other folks take up the space, and mobilizing their words in order to keep change happening, right? And so I think that that's the main things that I would say I've learned about allyship. And then the things that do more harm than good, we had a great conversation about guilt. So yeah, guilt is one of those things that can cause way more harm than good. Like I said, you can only say sorry so many different ways, and those sorries aren't really going to make so much change if you don't actually do the work. And then defensiveness without reflection. So I think that instead of being called in and not seeing that as a gift, someone is giving you a gift of, hey, I believe that you can change, and I believe that you can still be part of this fight. And if you're defensive to someone calling you in on mess ups, then you're going to sit and regret it. I know that defensiveness is not really productive either. And then also, yeah, not talking over people. I think a lot of folks, in their pursuit of trying to be a good ally, they speak over people's experiences because they think that they're the expert. But if you are not the lived experience of the person that you're trying to be an ally for, then you shouldn't be talking over their lived experiences. Just take a seat and listen up.
Those are great. Thank you, Steph. You hit some great home runs. Be reflective. I'm like writing them down for myself. Be reflective. I don't get to decide. I need to listen to what's needed. There's a quote that I want to share with everyone by Jonathan Van Ness, and it says, I think for a lot of people, it's easy to have things not affect you. So to be a better ally, you have to look at it as if it's someone you know, instead of this abstract person you've never met. Right. And again, a lot of times when we're talking about allyship, the issues itself is so abstract because it doesn't affect you. And so I really, resonate with this point in that you have to think of it, like you have to personalize it. You have to think of it as if it's someone that you know and you really care about for you to even maybe enter into the space of trying to understand, right? But for a lot of people, it's true. It's easy to have things just not affect us. Mm-hmm. So Tola, you've worked with a variety of people, helping them navigate a variety of systems. Do you think allyship looks similar or different to a variety of people?
So in my personal opinion, I think that allyship looks different. And the reason being is because, again, just as I mentioned before, allyship, it's a journey, it's an individual journey for folks, right? Like I said, some folks, they've been in this like fight for a while. And there's some folks, like I said, who just literally just realized what allyship meant yesterday. They're just like, oh, what is this, right? And on the other side of the spectrum, you know, just as like Black folks, I think people need to understand that we're not monolithic and we all have our own different experiences. And what allyship means to me compared to what it means to you, Monique, is different. So for some folks, some racialized folks, allyship may mean literally sending a mere email and asking, how are you doing? And to other folks, allyship may mean being on the front lines and advocating and protesting, right? So I think, you know, it shouldn't be based on the metrics of the action, but it should be based on intentionality, right? Looking at intentionality, because if we measure based on the actions, we're not really going anywhere. Really look at intentionality of being an ally, right? And measuring that than the actual actions of it. It's important.
I agree. Do you think between these differences, again, this is like a follow-up question to this, do you think that there's some commonality between people's definitions of allyship? Do you think there's common ground there?
I do think there's common ground. I think when we're looking at allyship, it's a fact of your role. I don't want to say role like it's this is your role, but you know, the goal is to try to take the heavy burden off of someone who's oppressed, right? So there's a commonality of, you know, I saw this quote, it's like, you're the backup singer. So when I think of a backup singer, I think of Destiny's Child. You know, at the end of the day, people may argue that Michelle and Kelly were the backup singers, Beyonce, right? Some people, I see Siobhan shaking her head, but I see it as you're the backup singer that's amplifying the voice of the racialized, amplifying the voice of the oppressed. So there's a commonality as in what is the goal? The goal is to really tackle the oppressed system. The goal is to really tackle the institutional systemic oppression that racialized folks are feeling, right? But when you look at the metrics of what the allyship is, I think that's where the difference is. But I think that we should really be focusing on the intentionality of that so that we know that we're all going the same place and we all have the same goal, right? Of really tackling that oppressive system.
Great. Thank you so much, Tola.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a really big question. We've talked about the importance of developing a sense of belonging today. We've talked about empathy as being foundational to ally work, but I'd like to hear from everybody, or anybody, I should say, our audience and our panelists. To what extent can one participate in allyship? In other words, are there any limitations that allies need to be aware of? Is there a line in the sand that has to be drawn that one can approach but go no further? Like, is there an extent to being an ally? Are there limitations? And what are those? And I can appreciate the silence because I have been wrestling with this for a very long time. So I can appreciate the silence and the reflection that's going on.
I guess I could maybe share something. For me, in terms of like what are the extents of being an ally and like how far, I think I can only be a good ally if I'm healthy. And so just really taking into consideration my self-care. And I saw a bunch of graphics go out like in the last couple of weeks, how like self-care resistance or something like that. And I think about that sometimes, just making sure that I'm taking breaks from, let's say, social media, if let's say that's the type of allyship I'm performing, or if I'm always going out and being part of organized like meetings, like, and if I'm feeling burnt out in any way, like kind of taking a break so that I can, sorry, my dog's crying in the background, do like run the marathon versus just the short race. So for me, the extent is just making sure that I'm healthy and playing the long game.
I think, yeah, for sure. I think our emotional or mental health is really important. I know it's not really relating to allyship, so to speak, but I remember from our last session, we were talking about the responding versus reacting, right? You're not going to be great help if you're just reacting, because emotionally you're not healthy, or mentally you're not in a healthy place, right? So I think it's important to be reflective and to assess, am I emotionally and mentally healthy enough so that I'm responding instead of reacting? Yeah, it's great.
Can I just add one thing, Monique, or say something? I think there's a limit to allyship and going back to intentionality piece, when it's lost. When you are an ally and it's focused on getting credit, focusing on it's about me, focusing on, well, I did this and I did that. Like when you think of a lot of politicians, when they're talking about what they've done for the Black community or what they've done for this community, when you hear it, you're like, but you're losing the focus of what it's really meant to be an ally. So I think when intentionality is lost, I think that's where there's that limit, that space where it's like, you need to stop, go back, reflect, and think about why you're doing this again.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's good. Someone says in the chat, first thing that comes to mind is to be mindful of expecting an oppressed person to relieve their trauma for the benefit of the perceived ally or perceived allyship.
Mm-hmm. It's a good one.
Yeah. I think that the limitations are largely based on the person's own capabilities and limitations. When I read that, I'm kind of thinking even about, I'm connecting, how much you know about a cause, for example, or it goes back to even intentionality, which what you're talking about, Tola, how educated you are, or your willingness to learn even, right? Your own capabilities and then the limitations that go along with that. It's a good point. Steph, I cut you off. You wanted to share?
Totally cool. I had two things that I was just thinking about based off of what Tola said, and then also in the back of my mind. So Tola, like what came to mind was that people use allyship as like clout chasing. And so like for that pat on the back, and you see that on social media like so often, and it's disillusioning. Like I know that I'll send messages to people and be like, what was the intention of posting this? Like, why did you post this? It's like the black screens when people were posting on Instagram. It makes sense. Like, I can see that you're trying to maybe mobilize a conversation, but like your conversation can't just end at you posting a black screen and saying that I'll stand with you. Like, what does the standing with you look like? And I think that people expect it to just be like, well, I'm saying that I'll do this, so I guess I'll do it. But what is that actually going to look like? And so allyship, I would say it's like, you don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. You don't have to just try, oh, I'm going to go to this protest. Oh, I'm going to sign all these petitions. Oh, I'm going to call all my politicians. Oh, I'm going to check in on all my friends. Like, you can do one thing and do it really, really well. Like, I know folks that know policy inside and out, and so they're really great at forming those emails that need to go to politicians. There's people that are sitting on like mountains of wealth. Like, if you are sitting on a mountain of wealth, how are you going to redistribute it to individuals? Are you focusing on Black trans individuals that are, at most risk in our society? Are you trying to foster the joy of Black communities? What are you doing with the money that you have? And so those are kind of the questions that come into my mind. Like, you don't have to be a jack of all trades. Just try your best to do what makes sense for your capabilities and do those things really, really well.
That's great. Thank you, Steph. Intentionality is key. I think here's the common theme that we've been kind of using right throughout. Intentionality is so important to the work as an ally. So as we move along in the conversation, I can only imagine how difficult it is to work with someone with different lived experiences in a role like yours, Siobhan, as a counselor, right? The curiosity, the questions that come along with that. How can students with specific lived experiences and then counselors with specific lived experiences work together as allies? What would you say is most important for allies to know?
That's a really good question in terms of how can students and counselors work together. And I think at Humber, I think what in terms of we can certainly work together. I think what we have to identify is are we working towards a common goal, and whose common goal is it? So if I'm working with, if I am, sort of proclaiming that I'm an ally, and I do like Steph's point, is that it's not something you wake up and you say, I'm an ally. And going back to Tola's point as well, is what are my intentions and whose goal, and what am I exactly fighting for? And when you talk about students, I'm going to engage students in that conversation. So, Monique, are you asking about sort of Black students? Are you talking about racialized students? Are you talking about white students? Are you talking about all students who, how can we work together towards a common goal?
I generalized it. So a student with a specific lived experience and a counselor with a specific lived experience that aren't related.
Oh, okay, yes. Okay, yes. So I think for that is, again, I think we can find nuggets of like similarities where we can work together. And I think going back to the first question you asked is that we also have to recognize the limitations in our own lived experiences when we're trying to support and we are trying to be allies. I think that we need to recognize that what are the limitations in myself? What are the limitations in my own experiences? And when do I step back? So sort of going back to when do we step aside and when do we step up?
I like that. When do we step up? Someone wrote something in the chat. I got to find, oh, there we are. Allyship is speaking up for others, mostly the vulnerable, right? So I like that. When do we step back? Knowing when to step back, but knowing when to speak up as well.
Yeah, so stepping aside meaning that I'm not going away. I'm not going away when the Black Lives Movement has hopefully doesn't lose momentum, but when my voice, when I can use my privilege in saying, you know what, I can use my privilege as a counselor because it might be easier for me to speak up rather than a student because I have a privilege in that role. But sometimes I need to step aside as well, right? Because my voice is not needed in that moment. That person can speak up, they can advocate. So I think we really have to ask ourselves those questions. Are we stepping up or do we need to step aside, but not disappear? Mm-hmm. Well, kind of like Michelle, I guess, Tola. Michelle.
Poor Michelle. Poor Michelle.
We're still there. We're harmonizing. We're there, but we're stepping aside and we're letting, we're waiting.
Yeah, I got you.
I answered the question, but I think hopefully you got something out of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that's great. Absolutely. So, Steph, what form of resistance do you uphold to advance the cause for social justice? And what would you say is most important for allies to know?
So the biggest form of resistance that I uphold is the fear of messing up. It is something that, that still sometimes gets in my brain. I'm like, what if I overstep? Or what if I'm not doing enough? What if I don't know, the words that I use or the wording that I use is harmful to someone. And so those things that eat at my brain are things that are stopping me from doing proper change, right? And I try to call myself in, why am I overthinking this? Or why am I afraid of messing up? Why is that the thing that I'm worrying about and not looking at the big picture? The big picture is that our society is still formulated in such a way that we're racist or we're anti-Indigenous or anti-LGBTQ plus, even calling in my own internalized stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's the biggest thing is that fear of making mistakes. And I think that in that fear, when you have the moment to call yourself in and wonder, why am I so afraid? It goes back to that, am I actually doing change this way? Is this helpful in mobilizing the processes that we need in order to dismantle the things that are upholding such traumatic stuff, right? And so that's my biggest resistance. And to that, just the call-ins and reflecting on, okay, well, if I mess up, I can do my best to make up for it and be actionable and keep doing the things that I have my eggs in the right baskets, and then I think that the biggest thing for allies, I guess, to know is that your emotions going through allyship are valid, and they're founded in the recognition that there's something not right. And at a baseline, there's something not right. And in that knowing, you'll keep taking time to learn, and that you don't just stop being an ally. Like, there's not a time in my brain that I just turn off the fact that the only reason why I have the rights that I have are because of Black trans sex workers that threw a brick at a building when cops were being terrible. The only reason why I get to work in a space that has a space for LGBTQ plus people are because of Black trans women. And so I try to keep that at the forefront, recognizing that I can't just stop being an ally because my community needs me and other communities need me, and they need me to be actionable. And so those are the biggest things. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing that. The fear of messing up can be paralyzing. I think it goes, hand in hand with guilt, right? It can be paralyzing. It'll cause you just to not even take a step in the right direction. It'll cause you to not act, period. Someone in the chat wrote, took a few moments to reflect. I think for my own personal embodiment of allyship, it goes beyond action. It circles back to what are my intentions and what have I learned, or bettered my understanding / learning. As an example, attached to the Black Lives Matter social media posts, there are a number of folks posting hashtag listening and learning, which is a huge piece. I really resonate with that hashtag. Sometimes it might take a moment to find the right time and way to act and share my allyship with others. It's great. Tola, in your opinion, what is most important for allies to know? How can Black community members and non-Black community members help each other advance the cause of justice, equity, and equality? How can we work together to address difference?
That's really interesting. A couple of things. I think number one is just that, so when I think of allyship, I think about how are you advocating for me when I'm not present, right? So a lot of folks think about, oh, allyship is like how are you advocating for me when I'm not present, when you are inhabiting spaces that I may not have access to, or I'm not present at that moment, how are you advocating for me? So reflecting on that. Going back to the piece of understanding that as a Black woman, that other Black women, we're not monolithic. We have different beliefs, the intersectionality piece. We have different experiences. Monique, you and me, we have different experiences, and understanding that. And so what allyship means to you, Monique, is different from what it means to me. And then also I would say that also understanding that as Black folks, we need to heal. Right. I think that healing aspect, I think a lot of folks are like, okay, what action do I need to take? What action do I need to take? That's great. But also understand an action that Black folks need to take is that we need to heal. We are always so constantly on the fight, just to fight all the time and just, based on oppression institutions. But there's also an aspect of healing that I think that as the Black community, we really need to focus on as well, too. And so as an ally, really encouraging that healing aspect is really important, right? Because there's been so many folks who've been on the front lines fighting for this for a while, but never really got the opportunity to reflect and heal on the trauma that has been going on for many, many, many years, right? So I think that's something I would want to tell allies. And also, how can we work as a community? I think number one is doing the work, right? Do the work. Even for myself, there's still work that I need to do. And thank you, Steph, for raising the fact that there's some mistakes that you have made, right? And there's some mistakes that I'm going to make, right? And leaving room for those mistakes, for learning from those mistakes, but doing the work, right? Reading on so many things, educating yourself and gaining that knowledge as to what to do, because, even with EDI, it's something that's evolving. It changes all the time. Really learning a lot, the language, the movement, everything. and not getting so caught up with the noise, but understanding that this type of struggle is something that is ongoing. It doesn't stop after the hashtag stop, right? It's still going. And so I think as a community, really doing the work and really building our racial resilience to come to the table and have those difficult conversations, not to be defensive, but really grasp it. Again, sitting in your discomfort. But then when you're doing that, you're really gaining and building up that racial resilience. So I think once we do the work, then we can hopefully get to the point where we can create and maintain the space for folks to come to the table and have a discussion and then build on what action we need to do after that.
Absolutely. Someone in the chat says, yes, going back to last week's discussion, Black healing is central to Black resistance. Absolutely. Taking a pause can be part of our healing, right? And I think forgiveness, I think, is something also to mention is really important, right? If we understand that as we move through this work, this difficult work, the work that takes time and intentionality with a bunch of imperfect people, I think we need to be forgiving, not just of ourselves, but I think we need to also be forgiving for others so that everybody is learning, right? And I think that's really important. Yeah. So for members of the Black community that are listening in today, we are going to be uploading a document in the chat that has a lot of suggestions on how we can continue to advance this cause. So, please take a look at it. There's a lot of practical suggestions of what we can continue to do for members of the Black community. And I want to hear from the audience as well. From your personal and professional experiences, I've asked the panelists, audience members, I'm asking you, what would you say is most important for allies to know? We've talked about empathy. We've talked about difference. We've talked about forgiveness and healing. What would you say is one of the most important things for allies to know? This goes into our bag of tools from today. What's most important for allies to know? Anybody from the audience? It's most important that we know it's not about us. Huge. Thank you for sharing that. In April, Dawn, would you like to share? Go ahead.
Again, understanding we still have so much privilege, right? That as an ally, listening to everyone, that even as we try to be an ally, we're going to approach it from a place of privilege. And therefore, the listening and learning, the I think, Tola, you said, like, checking your ego, like it's nothing to do with who you are or what your experience is. But I think that's the part that I keep taking away for myself. I'm a white, female, highly privileged person as a settler in Ontario, Toronto, Canada. And so I just think all of my lived experiences, I just have to keep remembering how much privilege I bring to even wanting to speak right now, that I just have to keep listening and learning to these dialogues.
Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you. Yes, listening and learning is so important. There was somebody else who had their hand up. I'm not sure if you want to share.
I believe it was Chantel Joy. I saw Chantel on there. Yeah.
Chantel, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. What I wanted to share, and this is a lesson I learned a really long time ago, and Steph sort of spoke to this, which is some of us come to the table with experiences of oppression ourselves in some respect. And we can often make the mistake as an ally of thinking, well, I understand what other oppression is because I've experienced X or Y, right? And as an ally, I have had to, in moments, really kind of park my stuff and really set it aside, because I can often go to the place of, well, I understand the experience, or I have known oppression, therefore I am not an oppressor. And that is not true, right? Both those things can exist. I can have experienced oppression and be the oppressor. And sometimes I have to be willing to focus on someone else's experience of oppression singularly without bringing the rest of my stuff into the picture.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Just want to read a couple of comments in the chat. We need to know how to constructively speak with others who are not yet allies. That's important. Educating ourselves on issues and acknowledging, checking our privilege. You will make mistakes. Here we are. You will make mistakes. When you do, apologize sincerely and do the work to learn from your mistake without further burdening others. It is important for allies to know about issues that are ongoing, how to face or address these issues, speak up, know their audience, and take actions. Learn effective tools on how to interrupt when we observe people being treated unfairly. Yeah, these are great. April Dawn, did you have another comment or was your hand up from before?
Down. My apologies. It won't. My computer's not behaving right now.
Okay, so that was from before.
Yeah, thank you.
So I would like everyone to kind of think about this question as we close. What experience or value do you hold on to that moves you towards justice? And I ask this question in my workshops. You know, what experience brought you here, or what value brought you here? What experience had at one time rendered you vulnerable? And I believe that asking that question helps to establish our why. And our why is important to establish so that when things get murky, unclear, when you become frustrated with maybe the lack of progress, frustrated with working with people who aren't interested in having these kinds of conversations, it's important to go back to your why. It's going to be your bedrock. And so again, what experience or value do you hold on to that moves you towards justice? Let that be your anchor in this work that we have to do. There's a quote that says, "It isn't until you begin to fight in your own cause that you become really committed to winning and become a genuine ally of other people struggling for their freedom." Mm-hmm. It isn't until you begin to fight in your own cause that you become really committed to winning and become a genuine ally for other people struggling for their freedom. I think that's important. I just want to leave, we got a couple minutes, and so before I completely close, I just want to leave a little bit of space for anyone that had any questions. There was one question I wasn't sure where to insert it, so I'm going to share it right now. Panelists or audience members, you can ask a question at this time. However, I also want to point out that this question is going out to everybody. Speaking of space, we were talking a lot in the beginning about space. How do you address people who think that these spaces are an act of segregation? How do we address people who think that these spaces are an act of segregation? I think yes, and I think someone asked, do you mean the base? I think perhaps the question was around places like the base or LGBTQ plus resource center, or why do we have an EDI, right? Group or groups, I should say, within Humber. What do we say to people who think that these are spaces of segregation?
I think a key question you need to ask a person is, why do they think this? Right? Why are they thinking this? You know, it's kind of the idea of like, oh, reverse racism, right? Like, why do they think this? Why do they have this idea? And, you know, I challenge folks to understand that if a system is set up that is not set for particular folks, wouldn't you want a system that these individuals can belong to? Wouldn't you want a system where these folks can come, where they can, and I'm very careful, and I use this word loosely, safe, like a safe space. I use that word very loosely because people can question and say there's no such thing as a safe space, but wouldn't you want folks to feel a sense of belonging in a system that's set up not for them, right? So I challenge folks to think of it in that regard, right? So.
Yeah, thank you. Someone says, okay, go ahead. Yeah, Siobhan.
Just to add to what Tola said, is that reminding folks that the space and the system was set up for a specific group of individuals. And when there are spaces created, you're bringing other folks to, giving them, you're bringing them to the table where they didn't have space before. So rather than segregation, we're within a white space in a white system. And what we're doing is, by having a base, having the Aboriginal Resource Center, having the LGBT plus Resource Center, we're saying, hey, we're going to take up some of that space, because there, folks have been missing for a long time from this space that you're looking at it very, very, like, almost reverse. So I would also want to have a conversation about that and ask about reflecting on reflecting on that.
If I can also add a little bit, I think that it isn't fair to not expect people to want to experience joy and grief within their communities. So thinking about the times where I had to act a certain way in relation to other people because of my gay reality, or like my trans reality, the times where I had to try to pass a certain way in order to navigate systems. I can't be my most authentic self unless I have something to fall back on, some kind of community to experience the grief of having to change myself in order to navigate the different world, or a place to feel joy about celebration of like our personhood. And I think that when people look at it as segregation, they're forgetting that there's so many different ways that people aren't allowed to experience their joy and their grief in public. They're not allowed to be with people that experience similar things because it's seen as wrong to experience our joys and our griefs. And so you can't, I would challenge them to think, like, how many times do you get to feel joy, and how many times do you get to feel shitty about things? You know, sorry for swearing, but like, how do you get to navigate those things in your systems? Why aren't you allowing Black folks to do that in their group? Or why aren't you allowing LGBTQ plus people to do that in their group? And if it's not hurting you, it's okay. Like, just let folks enjoy these spaces.
Right. You know, and I think it boils down to what someone shared in the group. It's just a lack of understanding of how privilege, what privilege is and how it works, right? And I think data tells a beautiful story. And even if we were to take a moment just to look at the spaces that we work in, well, outside of myself and maybe you, Steph, but if we were to look at maybe Humber on a whole, right, in a classroom, for example, or down the hallways, how many of those people look like you? How many are there of those people that actually look like you, right? Like, I think numbers really tell a story. And so community then is important, which is what you're sharing. It's hard for me to share my feelings about something, especially if it's, for example, that has to relate to my identity, when you may not, as an ally, you may not, or I shouldn't say as an ally, as a person that doesn't share my identity, you may not understand that, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, take a look around. Is how many people actually reflect your identity? You probably feel, as you said, safe, welcomed. You probably feel like you belong, right? Those are feelings that oftentimes people who are marginalized don't get to feel, which brings us back to the point of, this is one of the reasons why we need spaces like that, so that we can feel, quote unquote, safe, like we belong. It's important for me to see somebody in a position of power that looks like me. It shows me possibility. I can, because you have. Like, those things are really important. And I think these are some of the reasons why we have spaces like that.
And it also shows a sense of belonging, right? When I see someone who's reflective of me, I'm going to a space where I'm like, I belong here. I feel included here, right? So it really goes back to the idea of inclusion and self-belonging, and trying to avoid the idea of tokenism but really ensuring that if you're diversifying and you're seeing more folks that look like you have a sense of belonging, that you belong in this space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience members, for your participation, for sharing your areas of expertise, your experiences with us today. Thank you. Please take a moment before you leave today to, fill out the survey that will be also in the chat. We're going to be uploading some of these points that we've talked about today. We're going to be uploading them through an infographic on allyship over social media over the next couple of days. So please feel free to check them out. And I want to leave us with a quote. Martin Luther King Jr. said that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So let's use our voices to stand up and to speak out for equality and the freedom for all people. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. Have a great day.